August 1944. An American battalion is completely cut off and surrounded by Nazi forces in western France. Hoping for rescue, lookouts spot an American vehicle approaching their defensive perimeter.
The first thought has to be, our relief is here. It must be a reconnaissance element of some sort, and they've come to save us.
But hope turns to horror as German soldiers pour out an open fire. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces finally land troops in Normandy to open the Western Front. But Nazi fanatics and diehards continue to fight ruthlessly for survival. D-Day was a battle. The Allies still need to win the war. August 8, 1944. Near Saint-Malo, France. Members of the 121st Infantry Regiment enter the small village of Pleurtuis as they press to the French coast. With L Company in the lead, Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Eyler orders his men to prepare to spend the night to allow other battalions to catch up. After 2 days of fighting, there is no sign of the enemy. Everything is still.
By this point in the war, the 3rd Battalion has been through enough combat to understand that you don't necessarily want it to be all that quiet.
A German tank engine roars to life from a side street. At the same time, German machine guns and rifles open up. Their fire targets the American soldiers from upper windows and nearby doorways.
This is late in the day, soldiers may be a little bit tired, but all of a sudden, instant adrenaline.
The result is chaos. Without armor of their own, the Americans are virtually defenseless. The American 121st Infantry Regiment have been assigned to the 83rd Infantry Division to help capture the French port city of Saint-Malo. 2 months after D-Day, the Allies have a supply problem. Machines, equipment, and supplies they need to liberate Europe pile up in Great Britain. Allied planners hoped to land 725,000 tons of war material in July, but only 450,000 tons came ashore. Most of it at Omaha and Utah, the original D-Day beaches. They need a proper port. Capturing Saint-Malo would help. It has been a famous ocean port for hundreds of years. Its walls contain a medieval fortress known as the Citadel. Sitting high with water on 3 sides, the Citadel is perfectly positioned to rebuff attack from any direction. It was further fortified by the Nazis after the occupation of France in 1940.
In February 1944, Hitler declares a number of seaports in France and in Belgium and the Netherlands as fortresses, so in German as Festungen.
The defense of Festung Saint-Malo is commanded by Oberst Andreas von Auloch.
When a city is declared a Festung, the commandant of the fortress gets full power over all troops garrisoned in this fortress. So he's something like a little king in his own little kingdom. Even for the time, von Auloch is an eccentric character. He wears a monocle always gives orders in a snarling voice.
Von Auloch is a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he had fought the Soviets.
He had fought in Stalingrad. He knows what street-to-street and house-to-house fighting is.
Von Auloch's skills will be tested as the U.S. 83rd Infantry Division sets to capture the strongholds that ring Saint-Malo. The 121st Infantry Regiment targets the town of Dinard, also fortified to protect Saint-Malo from across the Rance River. Less than 4 miles from Dinard, in the village of Pleurtuis, the advance of the 121st comes to a dramatic halt. The Americans report a German tank firing its gun. Enemy soldiers use the safety of nearby houses to pick off the lead company. Lieutenant Colonel Eyler orders his men to retreat. 2 have already been killed, and others wounded. They withdraw under fire, and the battalion suffers more casualties as they fall back. The Americans take up a position 400 yards southeast of town. The Germans do not pursue. Eyler commands the 121st Infantry Regiment's 3rd Battalion, made up of about 800 men. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions both set off the day before, but encountered strong resistance.
The Germans try everything to slow down the Allied advance, so they set up roadblocks so that every road is an obstacle to the Americans.
Any men on the left and on the right? Move!
The German defensive positions are organized as Kampfgruppe, or Battle Group Bacherer, named for its commanding officer, Oberst Rudolf Bacherer.
Bacherer is a cavalry officer from the First World War, becomes a civvy in the interwar years, and then is called up for service again in the Second World War as a reserve officer. He seems to be a very competent and brave commander with loads of battle experience from the Eastern Front. Then in 1944 he's fighting in Normandy as a regimental commander and takes over command of 77th Division when the actual divisional commander dies.
Bacherer must now make the capture of Saint-Malo as expensive as possible for the Americans.
Down! Get down!
Earlier that day, Eyler had managed to break through one of Bacherer's roadblocks on the left flank and pulled ahead of 2nd Battalion. But after being pushed out of Pleurtuis by Bacherer's men, they will wait for the other battalions to catch up, then capture Pleurtuis together in the morning. As they dig in, Eyler sends word to bring forward the aid station and battalion surgeon to treat the wounded. Early the next morning, Private First Class Albert Mixon and Corporal Ben Graves head back towards the roadblock behind the American position. They must replenish supplies to prepare for the coming attack. In the darkness, Mixon spots what he believes are other members of his battalion near the roadblock. He realizes his mistake when they fire on his jeep. Mixon flees back to the American line. As he reports to his platoon sergeant, the Germans open fire. striking 3 American jeeps and blowing up 2 loads of ammunition. Mixon and the others hold off the attack to hook up with the rest of 3rd Battalion.
The troubling thing about this attack, it's coming from behind. And of course, you never want that.
Lieutenant Colonel Eiler sends out a patrol and confirms that the roadblock is now heavily defended by enemy soldiers. Eiler and his men cannot advance into Pleur-Thuit without reinforcement, and now cannot retreat. They are trapped. When he reaches headquarters, Eiler receives his orders. The battalion is to hold at all costs. August 1944, Western France. German forces recapture a roadblock behind an American unit.
Bacher surrounds the US battalion and encircles it. It's very typical for German doctrine in the Second World War. If there is a chance, try to regain the initiative as soon as possible. Counterattack at the soonest opportunity, and this is a classical example of that.
Lieutenant Colonel Eiler has been ordered to hold their tenuous position at all costs.
He's going to do what most any battalion commander in the U.S. Army would do, which is to begin to fan out his companies and create a perimeter to maximize his firepower.
In his perimeter defense, I Company sits on the right of the road, across from L Company, with K Company to the rear. Eiler sets up a command post at the center, in a 1-story farmhouse. Eiler is fortunate that the regiment's anti-tank guns kept pace with them the day before. They are now positioned with L Company to guard the road to the village of Pleur-Thuit, which had been their objective. Now, Nazi forces surround them on all sides. The American attack will have to wait. At around 0930, men from I Company spot something strange. About 15 German soldiers crawl along a ditch beside the road from Pleur-Thuit, gray blankets on their backs as crude camouflage. The men from L and I companies wait patiently. Until the Germans close within 200 yards. Then open fire. Three Germans are killed and several wounded. The remainder withdraw back to the village.
The purpose of this is probably to probe the perimeter, to get a sense of what kind of strength they're facing on the opposite side. It's a little bit of a clumsy probe, but probably just that.
But only 30 minutes later, explosions erupt. German artillery and mortar fire start to fall within the American defensive perimeter. And in quick succession, the command post is struck by 2 direct hits. 2 officers are killed, and 2 NCOs are injured.
This 10 o'clock counterattack clearly shows that the Germans are not defeated, that the Germans are able to launch a counterattack, and that the Germans are still able to inflict heavy casualties upon the Americans.
It's very shocking to see officers at that level killed so quickly. This was a bad situation. It creates a sense of fear and crisis among any soldier.
As the rescue and first aid efforts continue, the men hear the worst possible sound. A Stug 3, a German self-propelled assault gun built on a Panzer chassis.
To a typical American infantryman, enemy armor is terrifying. It doesn't really matter the particulars of what it is and what it isn't. What does matter is it does create a kind of a tendency towards fear and panic, that a tank can basically wreck and destroy your world.
The Stug 3 approaches from the northeast, followed closely by infantry. When it gets within 500 yards, its gun opens fire. In the panic, it appears that the command post may be completely wiped out. The Stug 3 closes in to about 300 yards. Suddenly, assistance from a completely unexpected place. A young private, Francis Gardner, takes matters into his own hands. He aims with a bazooka.
A bazooka is one of the standard U.S. Army anti-tank weapons, and it basically looks like a pipe. It's about 3 feet long, and it's held over the shoulder, and it fires a rocket that has a special anti-tank warhead called a shaped charge. So even though the rocket is quite small, it can penetrate a great deal of armor.
The 3.5-pound rocket can be launched up to 600 yards through as much as 5 inches of armor plate. Gardner's first shot misses. But the American anti-tank guns open up at the same time. A shot hits and disables the Stug 3. As the crew tries to escape the flames, Gardner lines up a second shot. This time, he does not miss. His shot strikes and kills the fleeing crew.
Americans love these underdog stories of the bespectacled soldier who takes out a German tank kind of thing. What is unusual in this instance is, yes, of course, it's very customary for troops to fire at a retreating tank crew as they get out of the tank, but not usually with a bazooka. The bazooka is not really designed to be that kind of anti-personnel weapon, but according to the accounts, it kills the tank crew. So it must have been a really accurate shot, and they must have been in the exact wrong place at the wrong time.
The German infantry soldiers join the battle and press forward into the fray. But the Americans hold the line. After 20 minutes, the Germans fall back towards the village of Pleurtuis. Within the American perimeter, the battalion is in disarray. After 3 attacks in rapid succession, along with the attack the day before, there are more and more wounded. The battalion surgeon had not made it through the roadblock the night before. There is no doctor. All they have are the limited medical supplies of an advancing battalion.
A lot of bandages, pressure bandages, tourniquets, morphine ampules. You would have sulfanilamide, like what they called sulfa powder, which was to combat infection in a wound. You might have some blood plasma here and there.
Care is provided by soldiers called medics.
A 19 or 20-year-old kid who's been basically given 2 months or so of rudimentary first aid medical-oriented training, designed basically to save lives quickly, patch them up, and then get them back to somewhere else where they're going to get more substantial medical care.
Unable to evacuate his wounded, Eiler establishes an aid station with medics from each platoon. They set up in another farmhouse just behind the command post. It is primitive, but it is all they've got. As German artillery continues to target the battalion's position, the medics and the wounded face a new kind of fight. August 9th, 1944. The American 83rd Infantry Division has orders to capture the French port of Saint-Malo. Allied forces fight street by street to capture the city. Its defenders are defiant. When called to give up, Oberst Andreas von Auloch allegedly replies, "I am German. Germans never surrender." Meanwhile, the U.S. 121st Infantry Regiment is supposed to take out the German guns in nearby Dinar. However, 2 battalions have gotten bogged down, and the German defenders close the gap behind the 3rd Battalion, cutting them off from the others. Word of the lost battalion makes it up the 83rd Infantry Division's chain of command to General Robert Macon.
General Robert Macon had seen a lot of combat in this war. He had been a regimental commander in the invasion of North Africa. When the 83rd had fought in Normandy, he had fought quite successfully given the circumstances and the terrain and the difficulties. Macon is a mission-first kind of guy, and he's someone you can rely on.
But Macon is not impressed with the 121st Regiment assigned to him.
If I'm a platoon leader and I think the 3rd platoon isn't any good, because I'm the 1st platoon leader and these are my guys, well, this can be true all the way up the line to a division commander who will trust his guys in the 83rd Infantry and his 3 regiments. He doesn't know the 121st Infantry.
Macon finds the slow progress of the 121st suspicious. Having an entire battalion of 800 men encircled by the enemy further undermines his confidence. But before he can turn his attention to rescuing the 3rd Battalion, Macon's 83rd Infantry Division must capture St. Joseph's Hill on the east side of the Rance River.
There was a gigantic granite outcropping that the Germans had fortified with a number of bunkers and also with 4 155mm guns. So until they could eliminate that defense post, they really couldn't conduct the campaign to reduce the rest of the Saint-Malo fortifications.
The lost battalion will have to wait. On the west side of the Rance, within the vulnerable defensive perimeter of the 3rd Battalion, the medics do their best to keep the wounded men alive. Many, however, have lost a lot of blood. Surrounded by the enemy on the ground, the only hope comes from above. A plan develops to have 2 planes from the 56th Field Artillery drop blood plasma. All goes smoothly, with the crates landing within a few feet of the drop zone. But triumph fades fast. As battalion members watch the planes lock wings and tumble to the ground. Members of K Company crawl toward the burning wreckage. It is too late. There is nothing they can do to help. All 4 airmen are killed in the crash. But the blood plasma gives the gift of life. By the end of August 9th, Macon's 83rd Infantry Division captures St. Joseph's Hill. He reorganizes his forces and assigns his 331st Infantry Regiment to liberate the lost battalion and then together capture Dinar. Macon takes personal command to make sure they do. As the 3rd Battalion awaits rescue, the men remain surrounded by the enemy and on high alert. Just after midnight, a lookout spots an American vehicle emerging from the fog, southeast of the perimeter. Help may finally have arrived. August 1944. A battalion of American soldiers, fighting to liberate the French city of Saint-Malo, have become encircled by German forces commanded by Colonel Rudolf Bacherer. Bacherer has ordered a series of attacks against the GIs. Late one night, an American vehicle approaches the U.S. defensive perimeter.
The first thought has to be, oh my gosh, our relief is here. It must be a reconnaissance element of some sort, and they've come to save us.
It almost seems miraculous until shots ring out from the darkness at the Americans. The car had been captured by the Germans. They're using it to penetrate the American lines.
Captured enemy kit was quite useful in the war for both sides. And at this stage of the war, an American reconnaissance car comes in quite handy.
So instead of a rescue force, the car is a Trojan horse. Staff Sergeant Clyde Webster responds quickly and grabs a BAR, ready to fight back.
BAR is the abbreviation for Browning Automatic Rifle, and it's the squad automatic rifle in a U.S. Army infantry squad.
It is classified as a light machine gun with a 20-round clip.
It offers automatic fire, meaning that when the gunner starts firing it, it's just round after round after round, unlike a rifle, which is semi-automatic, which means that you have to fire a round at a time. You have to keep squeezing the trigger.
Easily operated by a single soldier, it is considered one of the most reliable weapons of the Second World War. American rifle fire ignites the car. The crew within try to escape the burning vehicle. Webster picks them off one by one, then continues his attack against other German soldiers advancing in support. The fighting continues intermittently until 0330, when the surviving German troops melt back into the night. The steady stream of attacks continue to draw down the battalion's limited supplies.
An infantry unit, when it goes into combat, usually will only carry a small amount of ammunition and a small amount of food.
As a combat unit, there is no kitchen facility or mess hall. The men have only K-rations. A package which weighs a little over 2 pounds and contains dehydrated and canned food. They can be carried by individual soldiers, and some were transported by vehicle. The men of the Lost Battalion enter their 4th day since leaving the security of the American lines. Still without a doctor, regular GIs called medics care for men with their limited medical supplies at the Purple Heart Hotel.
Purple Heart Hotel, as the Americans colorfully called it, was just a makeshift aid station, right there where the wounded are gathering and where you see, I think it's fair to say, the worst of the suffering of the battalion.
There is no way to protect the injured from the incoming German artillery. Despite the shortages, some of their patients are German.
Even in a situation like this where they're surrounded, they cared for them, almost always. And in many cases, the medics prioritized based on the severity of the wound rather than nationality. That wasn't always true, but in this case, it was, because there were some pretty badly hurt Germans.
The American position is tenuous.
Think about it. We're surrounded. We don't know the size of the German force. It's very possible that all of us will become POWs tomorrow or the next day. So it might behoove us to treat the Germans well if we hope to be treated well in captivity too.
On August 10th, General Macon arrives at 121st Regiment's headquarters to assume command of the mission to locate the 3rd Battalion and capture Dinar. By 2000 hours, the men of Macon's 331st Infantry Regiment jump off and advance. Throughout the night, flares and colored smoke are used to signal and locate the lost battalion. Despite their efforts, no contact is made. Macon's men return to action the next morning, jumping off at 0830. Their progress is slow, as they encounter the same roadblocks and resistance that delayed the 121st.
Now that Macon is seeing the level of German opposition that they're facing, he begins to realize exactly what these guys from another regiment had been up against.
It is not until 2130 Macon's men break through a particularly tough roadblock. Before they even consolidate their position, they come under immediate counterattack by Backerer's men. So that evening, Macon finds himself defending his position and his lack of progress to his commander.
That happened all the time. Regimental commanders justifying to division commanders, division to corps, corps to army. And so Macon wants to make sure Middleton understands very clearly, hey, the resistance is tougher than we had thought. This isn't because of any deficiency on my part or my division.
From within the Lost Battalion's defensive perimeter, Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Eiler sends out regular patrols to connect with relief forces. But they have not had any success. So, on August 12th, rescue may seem unlikely for the patrol from K Company when they leave the battalion's defensive perimeter at 1100 hours. They move to the left flank in the hopes of locating members of the 331st. When they notice movement up ahead,
Get down!
A partir Pessoa, estreia domingo às 10h30 no National Geographic.
Este programa é patrocinado por The Famous Grouse.
a patrol of American soldiers from the 3rd Battalion, 121st Infantry Regiment creeps forward, hoping to make contact with the American 331st. The battalion has been encircled and cut off for 4 days by Nazi forces in their bid to liberate Saint-Malo, France. As they try to avoid the surrounding Germans, the patrol drops to the ground when they spot movement ahead. They have been discovered by Americans.
It's a great moment, you know, when the patrol realizes that these guys come from another unit to try and relieve them, and that this might mean help is on the way. That's such an American notion. Here we are embattled, and now the cavalry is here to help us.
The two patrols connecting is the first step. The 331st will still have to fight their way in through the surrounding Germans.
All of this takes many, many hours to develop, of course. So the patrol contact is just tip of the iceberg of what you're eventually going to need to do.
August 14th, 1944. The final breakthroughs put all 3 battalions of the 121st, in addition to the 331st Regiment, in position to finally capture the town of Dinard and knock out the guns defending the citadel at Saint-Malo. The Americans continue to encounter stiff German resistance under the command of Rudolf Backerer.
Backerer strikes me as a professional, not like a Nazi fanatic. He strikes me as more of a military professional of the sort who are really the backbone of the German armed forces and make such formidable enemies. He's going to use a lot of the architecture, which is very well suited to defensive warfare. A lot of heavy stone buildings and all that.
4 soldiers from Company G volunteer to attack a subterranean fortification, surrounded by a high stone wall and topped by a steel fence. Sergeant William Vaughan uses a bazooka to break through. With little effect. Vaughan eventually locates a tunnel through which he leads his group. The tunnel takes them inside, and they capture the position, rounding up 200 German POWs. At the same time, German defensive mortars try to halt the advance, while American guns target the Nazi strongholds. As night falls, fires burn. Dinard is in flames. Despite the fact the Americans make it all the way to the coast, they have yet to locate and capture Rudolf Bakkerer, the defiant commander of Dinard. Early the next day, the phone in Bakkerer's bunker rings. The voice on the other end of the line introduces himself as American General Robert Macon.
Macon's able to call because the Americans had captured a German pillbox that had a phone line that basically went to Bakkerer. So, in a very logical way, pick up the phone and call the guy. If you want him to surrender, ask him yourself.
Through an interpreter, Macon explains that the Americans have captured all the German strong points in Dinard and asks Bakkerer to surrender.
Bakkerer refuses to surrender. For him, the terms are not honorable enough. But at the same time, he asks Macon to take care of his wounded.
Macon agrees.
Macon says, well, sure, we'll take care of your wounded. Absolutely.
A short ceasefire is organized. German wounded are transferred into American care as prisoners of war. Within minutes, the peace is once again shattered. With the goal of driving the Germans into final surrender, Bakkerer's position is targeted with white phosphorus. When an incoming shell strikes an ammunition dump, it sets off a massive explosion. Fires spread. The straw bedding in the dormitories speeds the flames. Bakkerer's men pour out to escape the smoke. Bakkerer sees that further resistance is impossible. He and 350 men surrender. Dinard has now fallen. But the citadel and the city of Saint-Malo still hold out. Colonel Andreas von Auloch remains defiant. With supporting guns from the west silenced, General Macon must now capture the final prize. August 1944, as 2 American regiments liberate the nearby town of Dinard. Other units, commanded by General Robert Macon, close in on the walled city of Saint-Malo. Located on the French coast, the Allies have been desperate to capture it, to help move men and materials into France to liberate Europe. The citadel of the city is held by Colonel Andreas von Auloch, who is known as the Mad Colonel.
The Germans also call him the Mad Colonel, but not necessarily in a negative way, yeah? So von Auloch was respected by his men, yeah? Because he was a character, he was eccentric, but still his men followed him, yeah?
American General Macon knows the job must be completed. They cannot leave pockets of German resistance behind them as they advance further into Brittany. The citadel must fall. Two 8-inch guns with a range up to 10 miles are brought within 1,500 yards of the fort. They are less efficient against the solid stone walls, but can target portholes and vents with direct fire. In addition, Macon positions companies with 4.2-inch mortars.
The 4.2-inch mortar crews would use a mixture of high explosive and white phosphorus smoke rounds. The high explosives would blow open the buildings. Then they would follow up with a smoke round because the white phosphorus had incendiary effects. The white phosphorus smoke shells would start the building on fire.
To further soften up the fortifications in the final drive, Macon relies on near-constant aerial bombardment. They drop a new kind of incendiary into the battle: jellied gasoline.
Jellied gasoline is probably better known as napalm, and it originally started its combat use during World War II.
It contains an additive to make it sticky.
Meaning that if you drop a big tank of this stuff from an aircraft onto a target, instead of the liquid simply spreading out, the jellied gasoline somewhat sticks to the material and it stays there and burns.
Lieutenant Colonel Seth McKee prepares to take off in his P-38 with 165-gallon tanks filled with napalm. As McKee flies over, he releases the tanks, which contain phosphorus grenades to ignite the napalm. Amazingly, it lands in a ventilation shaft of the citadel.
It brings to mind, obviously, Luke Skywalker's perfect shot against the Death Star in Star Wars. But it is somewhat that dramatic in terms of its effect.
The jellied gasoline is not used to burn the occupants.
When the jelly gasoline hits the top of a bunker, it starts sucking out all of the oxygen that's inside the bunker. And so it destroys a heavily defended bunker by suffocating the crews inside.
When McKee looks back, he sees the Germans have raised the white flag. He calls off his men, and they drop the rest of their incendiaries on another target. Soon after, von Auloch and 550 of his men surrender, despite the promise to hold out.
It's always quite difficult to tell whether these orders of fighting to the last cartridge, fighting to the last man, whether they really mean it for real. Quite often, they just give these orders in order to show to Hitler their will to resist, because they are summoned to fight to the last cartridge, and if they don't do this job, it will have consequences against the family.
It takes 2 weeks to capture the fortifications of Saint-Malo, occupied by the Nazis for 4 years. General Macon's troops are persistent. His 83rd Infantry Division captured nearly 10,000 German prisoners of war. The lost American battalion of the 121st weathered its 4 days of isolation. After the series of constant attacks, they report 31 killed, 106 wounded, and 16 missing. Unfortunately, von Auloch had ordered the port facilities destroyed on August 7th to ensure that they provide no assistance to Allied forces. So while the fall of the French port cities proves inevitable, Nazi holdouts tie up Allied forces for many weeks. This allows time for others to retreat and secure the German border and set the stage for a series of desperate battles. The war in Europe would continue for another 8.5 months.